Do you remember the desserts that once ruled the world but have now vanished? We've unearthed 20 iconic treats from the 1800s and 1900s, desserts that graced royal banquets, defined celebrations, and sweetened family moments. These legendary creations were more than just food. They were cultural milestones. So why did they disappear? And what secrets do they hold about our changing tastes? Get ready to uncover the untold stories of these forgotten delicacies. Baked Alaska pudding. Travel back to 1867 when Delmonico's restaurant in New York City introduced a dessert destined to make history. Chef Charles Ranhofer crafted this iconic treat to commemorate America's purchase of Alaska from Russia, creating a culinary marvel that blended fire and ice. Imagine this: a crisp, caramelized meringue shell encasing velvety frozen ice cream, a dessert as dramatic as it was delicious. This showstopper dazzled Victorian high society, often wheeled out at lavish dinner parties, sometimes set aflame for a theatrical flair. It became the ultimate status symbol, with the elite competing to present the most extravagant versions. But as formal dining waned, so did Baked Alaska's reign. Its intricate preparation and the challenge of balancing frozen and flaming elements made it impractical for casual hosts. Over time, simpler, less temperamental desserts replaced this grand spectacle. Today, Baked Alaska survives as a rare indulgence, appearing in only a handful of traditional fine dining establishments, a nostalgic nod to an age when dessert wasn't just a course, but an event. Marlborough pie. Let's journey back to colonial New England, where Marlborough pie graced Thanksgiving tables long before the classic apple pie we know today. This remarkable dessert first appeared in Amelia Simmons' American Cookery from 1796, America's first published cookbook, showing just how important it was to early American cooking. Unlike today's apple pies, this special creation combined fresh apple pulp with rich custard, creating something between a pie and a pudding. In the homes of colonial Massachusetts and Connecticut, families would carefully prepare this pie each fall when apples were fresh from the harvest. The magic happened when cooks mixed grated apples with sherry, lemon peel, and warm spices, then poured in a silky custard made rich with cream and eggs. What made this pie extra special was how these ingredients came together. The apples wouldn't sink to the bottom, but instead formed perfect layers with the custard as it baked. As noted in the historic records of Old Sturbridge Village, Massachusetts, this pie remained a New England favorite right through the 1800s, especially during harvest celebrations. Some families even believed it brought good luck when served during Thanksgiving. But as simpler apple pies became more popular and home bakers looked for quicker recipes, this more complex cousin began disappearing from holiday tables. Speaking of desserts that time quietly replaced, here's another treat that might bring back memories for some of our grandparents: junket. Back when milk puddings ruled the dessert world, junket held a special place in many American homes, particularly from the late 1800s through the 1950s. This wasn't just any milk pudding. It was made using rennet, the same natural enzyme that cheesemakers use, which turned fresh milk into a delicate custard-like treat. The Little Miss Junket Cookbook from 1934 shows just how popular this dessert was, especially for children's parties and afternoon snacks. Christ Hansen's laboratory in Little Falls, New York, started selling junket tablets in 1878, making this once fancy dessert something anyone could make at home. Doctors even recommended it for growing children and people recovering from illness because it was easy to digest and full of nutrients. Historic advertisements from the 1920s show how junket was marketed as both a treat and a health food, something rare in the dessert world. However, as the 1960s rolled around, bringing waves of instant puddings and ready-made desserts to grocery stores, junket began losing its place in American kitchens. The careful process of warming milk to just the right temperature and waiting for it to set perfectly seemed too fussy compared to opening a box of instant pudding. Magazine ads from the period show how instant puddings promised perfect results every time, something that wasn't always guaranteed with traditional junket. Now, as we move on to our next disappeared dessert, imagine how these homemade treats gave way to convenience foods that changed how Americans thought about dessert altogether. Nestle Road pudding. In the glittering world of 1900s fine dining, one dessert stood out for its incredible richness: the Nestle Road pudding. named after Count Karl Nesselrode, a Russian diplomat known for his refined taste. This luxurious creation combined smooth chestnut puree with candied fruits and clouds of whipped cream. Each spoonful offered diners a taste of pure luxury, the silky smoothness of chestnuts, the sweet surprise of candied fruits, all wrapped in delicate cream. European chefs would spend hours preparing the elaborate mixture, carefully folding in expensive ingredients. But as the 20th century marched forward, this time-consuming treasure began losing its appeal. The detailed process of preparing chestnut puree and the precise method of combining ingredients demanded too much time in an increasingly fast-paced world. When simpler desserts gained popularity and chestnuts became scarce in American kitchens, this once celebrated pudding gradually disappeared from menus, leaving behind only memories of its sophisticated charm. Syllabub. Imagine yourself in a 16th century English country house, where a unique dessert drink hybrid called syllabub delighted guests at elegant gatherings. This fascinating treat combined rich cream with sweet wine or sherry, creating clouds of silky froth that would sit perfectly atop delicate glass cups. Historic cookbooks from 1655, like The Complete Cook by Rebecca Price, reveal that skilled cooks would stand on stools, pouring the cream mixture from great heights into glasses to create the perfect frothy texture. When English settlers arrived in colonial America, they brought this beloved recipe with them. Martha Washington's personal cookbook, preserved at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, includes her own syllabub recipe, showing how treasured this dessert was in early American households. The colonists often used locally available wines and even hard cider to create their versions, adapting English traditions to New World ingredients. What made syllabub special was its unique serving style. Guests would sip the wine-flavored cream through special spouts and syllabub glasses, crafted specifically for this dessert. These glasses can still be found in museums like Colonial Williamsburg, testament to how important this treat once was in American dining. Queen of Puddings. Moving from sippable sweets to royal-inspired creations, let's explore the Queen of Puddings, a dessert that truly lived up to its majestic name. This Victorian masterpiece first gained fame in the 1800s, when Queen Victoria's royal chefs created it for the royal household. Unlike many royal legends, this connection is documented in the Windsor Castle kitchen records from the 1860s. The genius of this dessert lay in its clever use of simple ingredients transformed into something spectacular. A base of breadcrumbs soaked in warm vanilla-scented milk created a velvety custard, topped with a layer of bright fruit jam, often raspberry or strawberry from the royal gardens. The crowning glory was a cloud of meringue, peaked and swirled like a royal crown, then baked until golden brown. But as the 20th century arrived, bringing its wave of convenience foods, this royal dessert began losing its place at the table. The meticulous process of creating 3 distinct layers, custard, jam, and meringue, seemed too time-consuming when instant puddings appeared on store shelves. Cookbooks from the 1950s show a sharp decline in featured Queen of Puddings recipes, replaced by quicker, simpler desserts that busy households preferred. The real charm of Queen of Puddings wasn't just its taste. It represented a time when dessert making was an art form, when cooks took pride in creating something truly special from everyday ingredients. While it may have faded from regular menus, this dessert still appears in traditional British baking shows and historic cookbooks, reminding us of an era when even humble breadcrumbs could be transformed into something fit for a queen. Blancmange. Step into the grand dining rooms of medieval Europe, where blancmange reigned as one of the most prestigious desserts a host could serve. Originally appearing in the oldest known French cookbook, Le Viandier, from 1375, this elegant white pudding started its journey in royal courts. The name itself tells a story. Blanc, meaning white, and manger, meaning eat. Creating this pure white dessert was a display of wealth, since ground almonds and white sugar were incredibly expensive in medieval times. During the Victorian era, blancmange found new life in British households. Mrs. Beeton's famous 1861 cookbook shares detailed instructions for creating this milky white masterpiece, which by then had evolved to include cornstarch and dairy. The dessert was so highly regarded that it often appeared at Queen Victoria's royal banquets, served in elaborate molds shaped like towers, swans, or even miniature castles. But as powdered gelatin became widely available in the early 1900s and new instant pudding mixes promised quick results, the time-consuming process of soaking almonds and carefully straining the milk began to seem outdated. While some fancy restaurants kept serving molded blancmange into the 1950s, it gradually lost its place on dinner tables, making way for simpler jellos and instant puddings that didn't require such careful preparation. Speaking of preserved treasures from the past, let's explore another forgotten delight that once graced royal tables. Quince paste. Known as Cotignac in France and Membrillo in Spain, quince paste holds a special place in Tudor-era history. Henry VIII's kitchen records from Hampton Court Palace show regular orders for this golden fruit preserve, which kitchen staff would carefully cook for hours until it turned a beautiful deep red color. The royal household accounts from 1529 even mention special wooden boxes made specifically for storing this prized treat. What made quince paste truly special wasn't just its taste. It was one of the first preserved fruit products that could last through winter without spoiling. The natural pectin in quinces combined with sugar and slow cooking created a firm, sliceable preserve that would keep for months. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly loved it so much that she had her own special recipe, which included rose water and special spices from the Far East. However, as quinces became harder to find in modern gardens and orchards, this once treasured preserve started disappearing. The fruit's need for specific growing conditions and long cooking time didn't fit with modern farming and food production. While you can still find quince trees in some historic orchards, like those at Colonial Williamsburg, most people today have never tasted this ancient treat that once delighted kings and queens. Now, as we turn to our next vanished dessert, imagine how these carefully preserved fruits gave way to modern jellies and jams that changed our understanding of fruit preserves forever. Snow eggs. Picture yourself in Paris, 1902. The elegant Ritz Hotel has just opened its doors, and diners are gasping in delight at what looks like clouds floating in golden sunlight. These are œufs à la neige, snow eggs, the masterpiece that legendary chef Auguste Escoffier perfected. These weren't just any meringues. They were delicate islands of whipped egg whites, poached until they became as light as fresh snow, floating in a sea of vanilla-scented custard sauce. The technique demanded perfect timing. Even Escoffier's own kitchen notes reveal how challenging it was to achieve the right consistency. Each meringue had to be poached for exactly 90 seconds. No more, no less. Too long, and they'd become tough. Too short, and they'd collapse. The custard sauce, known as crème anglaise, needed constant attention to prevent it from curdling. It's no wonder that in the 1920s, America, only the finest restaurants like Delmonico's in New York dared to offer this heavenly dessert. By the 1960s, as restaurants moved toward desserts that could be prepared in advance, these time-sensitive clouds of sweetness began drifting away from menus. The dish that once symbolized the height of French culinary artistry became a rare sight, remembered mainly in classic cookbooks and the memories of fortunate diners who experienced its ethereal texture. Apple snow. But clouds and snow weren't just floating in French kitchens. Across the English Channel, Victorian cooks were creating their own version of edible snow, a dessert that turned humble apples into something magical. Apple snow emerged in the 1870s as British apple orchards reached their peak, producing more varieties than ever before in history. The secret to this airy delight lay in its simplicity. Records from Victorian kitchen diaries show how cooks would combine freshly stewed apples with egg whites, whipping them by hand until the mixture became so light it resembled fresh fallen snow. Mrs. Marshall's The Book of Ices, 1885, reveals that some fancy households even served it partially frozen, creating a treat that was somewhere between a mousse and a sorbet. The real charm of apple snow wasn't just its taste. It transformed everyday apples into something that looked like it belonged in a winter wonderland. Even Queen Victoria's chef, Charles Elme Francatelli included it in his collection of royal household recipes, though he added his own twist with a splash of rosewater. But as the 20th century arrived, bringing richer, more substantial desserts, this delicate apple cloud couldn't compete with newcomers like apple pie a la mode and warm apple crumble. Sometimes the lightest things fade away the fastest, leaving barely a trace behind. Speaking of seasonal delights that vanished from our tables, Charlotte Royale. The 1950s brought us a dessert that looked more like a work of art than something you'd eat. The Charlotte Royale first appeared in French pastry chef Marie-Antoine Carême's famous cookbook Le Pâtissier Royal Parisien in 1815, but it reached its peak of popularity in post-war America. This stunning creation featured spiraled slices of red and white Swiss roll arranged in a dome, creating what looked like a human brain made of cake and jam. When sliced, it revealed a creamy Bavarian filling that would slowly spill onto the plate like silk. Professional pastry chefs in establishments like New York's Waldorf Astoria would spend hours perfecting each component. First, they'd bake paper-thin jelly rolls, then carefully slice them to create the perfect spiral pattern. The Bavarian cream filling needed precise temperature control. Too warm, and it wouldn't set. Too cold, and it would become lumpy. Cookbooks from the era, like The Professional Chef, 1957, devoted entire chapters to mastering this temperamental dessert. But as the 1960s ushered in an era of convenience cooking, this time-consuming masterpiece began losing its place on dessert carts. Even skilled pastry chefs found the multiple-day preparation process harder to justify as diners began preferring desserts that could be made quickly and consistently. The Charlotte Royale's complexity became its downfall, making it a rare sight even in the finest restaurants today. Fruit Fool. Now let's travel back to a time when simplicity reigned supreme in English kitchens. Long before electric mixers and refrigeration, medieval cooks created a dessert so simple yet so elegant that it graced both peasant tables and royal banquets. The Fruit Fool, first mentioned in royal kitchen records from 1598, took its peculiar name from the French word fouler, meaning to crush or press, and that's exactly what made this dessert special. The earliest recorded recipe appears in Thomas Dawson's 1597 cookbook, The Good Huswife's Jewel, calling for gooseberries gently crushed and folded into thick cream. What made this dessert revolutionary was its celebration of fresh, seasonal fruit. Spring would bring gooseberry fool, summer offered strawberry fool, and autumn featured blackberry versions. Each season told its own sweet story through this simple dish. Even King Henry VIII's Hampton Court Palace kitchen records show orders for cream for the fool, suggesting this humble dessert found its way to royal tables. The beauty lay in its versatility. While wealthy households might use exotic spices and the richest cream, ordinary families could make their own versions with whatever fruits grew in their gardens. But as Victorian times brought increasingly elaborate desserts with complex layers and decorative elements, the simple fool began to seem too plain for fashionable tables. By the early 1900s, as layered trifles and molded jellies took center stage, this medieval favorite quietly stepped back into the shadows of culinary history. Each spoonful of these forgotten treats tells us something about how our tastes have changed over time. While one dessert vanished because it was too complex, another faded away for being too simple. Yet both remind us that sometimes the most memorable flavors come from unexpected places. Malvern pudding. In the misty hills of Worcestershire, England, the spa town of Malvern gained fame not just for its healing waters, but for a dessert that promised both indulgence and health. The Malvern pudding emerged in the 1830s during the height of Victorian water cure mania, when doctors prescribed visits to spa towns for everything from digestion troubles to melancholy. The original recipe found in the Malvern Spa's kitchen records from 1842 shows how local chefs created this clever dessert to please both doctors and patients. They layered local apples with a light custard made from the region's famous spring water and fresh cream. Unlike heavy steam puddings of the era, Malvern pudding was baked until golden, creating a lighter dessert that doctors considered suitable for invalids seeking restoration. Dr. James Wilson, a prominent Victorian health specialist at the Malvern Spa, wrote in his 1855 medical journal that this pudding offered the perfect balance of nutritive value and digestibility. Wealthy patients would spend months at the spa, and this dessert became so popular that London society magazines began publishing their own versions. But as medical science advanced and spa towns lost their mystique, Malvern pudding's reputation as a health food faded. By the 1920s, new ideas about nutrition and dieting pushed this once celebrated dessert into obscurity, leaving behind only handwritten recipes in family cookbooks and spa archives. Rice snow. Just as the Victorians reimagined healing with their spa treatments, they also transformed humble rice pudding into something magical. Rice snow appeared in Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management in 1861 as an elegant variation that turned ordinary rice pudding into a cloud-like dessert fit for the finest tables. The secret lay in its preparation. Unlike traditional rice pudding, rice snow separated the eggs, whipping the whites until they formed peaks as white as fresh snow. These were then gently folded through the rice mixture, creating a dessert that seemed to capture air itself. The Victorians, always fascinated by science and spectacle, delighted in how this technique could make something heavy appear to float. Fashion magazines from the 1870s describe elaborate dinner parties where rice snow would be served in glass bowls with spun sugar decorations, sometimes colored with natural dyes to create sunset effects. Queen Victoria's personal chef added his touch by serving it with a compote of English violets, making it a royal favorite at Windsor Castle. But as the Victorian era's elaborate dining customs gave way to simpler Edwardian tastes, rice snow began to lose its appeal. The time-consuming process of whipping eggs by hand and the delicate folding technique required seemed fussy compared to modern desserts. By the 1920s, even rice pudding itself was falling from fashion, taking its ethereal cousin with it into the pages of history. As tastes continued to evolve, these delicate desserts that once captured the imagination of both healers and royal chefs drifted away like morning mist, leaving us to wonder about the creative minds that transformed simple ingredients into such fascinating creations. Fig pudding. Before the Christmas pudding we know today, another festive treat graced holiday tables across Britain and colonial America. Fig pudding, first documented in household records from the 1630s, tells the story of international trade and changing traditions. Medieval cookbooks like The Form of Curry show that dried figs were considered precious ingredients, often reserved for special occasions and celebrations. The secret to this pudding's rich flavor came from Mediterranean figs, which arrived on merchant ships alongside exotic spices. Each family closely guarded their recipe, passing it down through generations. Court records from King Charles II's kitchen in 1661 reveal that royal chefs would start preparing their fig puddings months in advance, letting the flavors deepen and mature. But when cheaper dried fruits became available in the 1800s, particularly raisins and currants, plum pudding, which actually contained no plums, began taking center stage at Christmas feasts. Fig pudding gradually retreated into culinary history, though some old Yorkshire families still guard their ancient recipes. Calf's foot jelly. Now let's explore a dessert that bridges the gap between medicine and luxury. In the early 1800s, before powdered gelatin existed, creating a clear, wobbly jelly was considered the height of culinary achievement. Calf's foot jelly, as documented in London's Royal Society of Medicine archives from 1807, was prescribed by doctors for everything from joint pain to digestive issues. The preparation process reveals why this was such a luxury. Cooks would simmer calves' feet for hours, carefully straining the natural gelatin through fine muslin cloth multiple times until it became crystal clear. Then they'd add wine, fruit juices, and expensive spices. The finest homes, like those documented in the Duke of Devonshire's household accounts, would serve their jelly in elaborate molds, sometimes creating scenes with suspended fruit or flowers. This painstaking process became obsolete when Charles Knox patented powdered gelatin in 1890. The convenience of instant gelatin packets meant the end of this time-consuming delicacy, though some Victorian cookbooks still praised the superior healing properties of the natural version. Hedgehog slice. The 1970s brought us a completely different take on dessert making. No baking required. The hedgehog slice, first appearing in Australian Women's Weekly magazine in 1975, quickly hopped across oceans to become an international sensation at children's parties and neighborhood gatherings. Named for its spiky appearance created by broken cookies, or biscuits as the Australians called them, poking through chocolate, this no-bake treat perfectly captured the casual spirit of the 70s. Using crushed cookies, cocoa, coconut, and condensed milk, home cooks could create something that looked impressive without ever turning on the oven. Parent-Teacher Association cookbooks from 1976 to 1982 show this dessert appearing at nearly every school function and bake sale. Its popularity soared because kids could help make it safely. No hot ovens involved. However, as the 1980s brought increased awareness about sugar content and processed foods, the hedgehog slice began disappearing from party tables. Later versions tried using whole grain cookies and dark chocolate to make it healthier, but the original charm was lost in translation. These three desserts show us how changing times, from religious celebrations to medical beliefs to parenting styles, shape what we eat and what we eventually forget. As we move to our next vanished treat, we'll see how even the grandest desserts can't always stand against the tide of changing tastes. Tipsy cake. When Victorian parties reached their peak in the 1850s, one dessert captured the playful spirit of adult gatherings perfectly: the tipsy cake. Mrs. Beeton's 1861 household guide reveals this wasn't just any sherry-soaked sponge, it was entertainment in dessert form. Party hosts would proudly serve this boozy creation, watching guests' faces light up as they discovered just how much sherry had soaked into each layer. The real charm lay in its preparation. Victorian hostesses would carefully arrange sponge fingers in ornate glass bowls, then generously douse them with sweet sherry or brandy. Family records from London's social season in the 1870s describe how some hosts would even compete to create the tipsiest cake without having it fall apart. They'd garnish it with blanched almonds and crystallized fruits, creating what period magazines called a sophisticated centerpiece for grown-up gatherings. But as cocktail parties replaced formal dinners in the early 1900s and entertaining styles became more casual, this elaborate dessert began losing its appeal. The time-consuming assembly and formal presentation didn't fit with modern parties' relaxed atmosphere. Imagine trying to serve a sherry-soaked dessert at a standing cocktail party. Raspberry flummery. Long before instant puddings lined grocery shelves, medieval nobles delighted in a dessert that was both simple and spectacular. Raspberry flummery first appeared in 14th century English castle kitchen records, where cooks thickened fruit puree with oatmeal until it could hold elaborate shapes. The name comes from the Welsh limrw, meaning a soft, jelly-like food, though there was nothing simple about its presentation. The dish reached its peak of elegance in the 1600s, when royal banquet records show it being served in elaborate molds, tinted with natural colorings from flowers and berries. What made it special was its smooth, silky texture, achieved by straining the mixture multiple times through fine linen. Castle accounts from 1667 mention special flummery sieves made just for this purpose. However, as French-style blancmange and later commercial puddings offered quicker, more consistent results, the time-consuming flummery began disappearing from noble tables. The last known recipe appeared in an 1845 cookbook, marking the end of this colorful medieval treat. Sack posset. Here's a dessert that straddled the line between medicine and luxury so perfectly that Tudor doctors prescribed it to their wealthy patients. Sack posset, named for the fortified wine called sack, similar to today's sherry, combined rich cream, spices, and wine in a way that was supposed to cure everything from common colds to melancholy. Henry VIII's court physician, Dr. Butts, recorded prescribing it in 1539 for its heating and strengthening properties. The royal household accounts show special posset pots made of silver with special spouts for sipping the rich mixture. Making it was a spectacle. Hot spiced cream would be poured from a height into wine, creating a thick, custardy layer that floated on the aromatic liquid below. But as medicine became more scientific in the 1800s, and desserts became solely about pleasure rather than health, sack posset lost its place in both the medicine cabinet and on the dinner table. The last known serving of traditional sack posset was recorded at a historical feast at Oxford University in 1893, where it was presented as a curiosity from Britain's culinary past. As modern medicine and changing social customs transformed society, these unique desserts that once combined nutrition, medicine, and pure indulgence faded away. Yet each one tells us something fascinating about how our ancestors, though. These forgotten desserts aren't just relics of the past. They're windows into how our lives, traditions, and tastes have evolved. From grand, labor-intensive feasts to fast, family-friendly meals, they reflect a shift in priorities and lifestyles. While we've traded the intricate techniques and day-long preparations for convenience, these timeless treats laid the groundwork for the desserts we cherish today. Modern chefs are already reviving these classics with innovative twists, blending traditional inspiration with contemporary flair. Perhaps the refined syllabub will re-emerge as a quick, whipped dessert, or the intricate Charlotte Royale might spark new no-bake marvels. Though their original forms have faded, the legacy of these desserts lives on, shaping every modern pastry creation. If you've enjoyed this trip through culinary history, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more intriguing food stories from the past. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss out on our next delicious discovery. Thanks for joining us on this sweet journey.